This is Samuel's Persiflage, episode number 2, the January 2006 edition. Yes, hello and welcome to Samuel's Persiflage episode number 2 with me, Samuel Gordon Stewart. Well, Wayne Mack, the radio historian and author of Don't Touch That Dial, Hits and Memories of Australian Radio. We'll probably spend most of the show chatting with Wayne about Australian radio and his book. It should be quite fascinating and I'm looking forward to that. Alright, well, we're joined now by Wayne Mack, a radio historian and former DJ, who has just released a book called Don't Touch That Dial, Hits and Memories of Australian Radio, which, as far as I can tell, is about Australian radio. Wayne, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Samuel. Good to be here.
Good to have you here. So, why did you write the book?
Well, a lot of the information that's contained throughout the 400 pages in this book hasn't been committed to paper before. There is no record of a lot of this stuff. This stuff being radio predominantly of the 60s, 70s and 80s. I mean, sure, you could go to the National Library and look through some old newspapers and read, say, Heather Chapman from the Daily Telegraph, her column every week, and you could find, who was who and all that sort of stuff. But there is no one-stop reference that is available of radio of this era. So now there is, and I'm pretty excited about that.
Yeah, well, it's been a long time in the working, and it's just been released, so it sort of picks up. When does it pick up in the history?
Well, the first chapter, funnily enough, actually goes back to the late 1800s and talks about a bloke called Marconi, but only very briefly. The first chapter is really a scene setter for people to kind of get an idea how radio came about as an entity, this thing we call radio. But by chapter 2, we hit the fast forward button and move up into, I guess, the late 50s, because that's the time when radio was going through profound change in Australia.
And also top 40 era.
That's it, yeah. In 1958 is when the top 40 first started on 2UE. And then we go right through the 60s, big time for radio, the 70s, the 80s, and by the end of the 80s we've tapered off, and I've left it go at that point. Because it's really, I don't think I could do justice to talking about the 90s at this stage. I mean, here we are in 2006. I think we could probably talk about the 90s in another 10 years.
Mm. Yeah. So you worked for 2CC back in, when is it, the 60s or 70s?
No.
70s.
Yeah, 70s, that's right.
Of course, because they didn't exist before then. So
exactly.
I almost threw their 30 years of broadcasting out the window then.
No, I started a few years after they started, and they started on the 31st of October, 75, and I came along about 3 years later in 78. But I had worked in the region. I'd worked in Bega on 2BE, which is now 2EC, and before that I was at 2XL, which, of course, is now owned by the same company that owns 2CC, but in those days it was an independent station, like so many of the country stations were when I got into radio. And, I was at 2CC as a jock. I started doing our Midnight to Dawn. Only did that for about a week or so, and then I found myself doing Drive for a little while. And we had a guy there called Trevor Sinclair who was doing nights, and he left and went to 2SM, and then I got his shift and I did nights, and then somebody else left and we did. They gave me breakfast. So in the time I was there, which
everywhere.
was 2.5 years, I think I did a stint in every shift except mornings.
Right.
So, yeah.
And, of course, then you went on to Program Director, which entirely different game.
Yeah, that was a little bit later. They had a change of management at 2CC in 1980, the middle of the year. It was the following year they had the change of management. What they had in 1980 was a change in format. CC had always been a top 40 hit music station, but the management kind of got tired of playing the top 40 round and round, and I don't think they wanted to be a young people station anymore. They got tired of it. So they got guys like myself and Rob Duckworth and a bloke called Ian Kennedy. We were all the younger kind of jocks that were there. We were all about 21 or 22, and they fired a few of us. And so we scattered around the place. Kennedy went over to 6 p.m. in Perth, and Duckworth went up to TUW. And I was up in Sydney visiting Duck one day, and he introduced me to Ronnie Sparks, who was the program director at TUW. And just over lunch, he said, "Look, I might have a slot for you." So I ended up going to TUW for about 6 or 7 months at the end of 1980 and 1981, which was a pretty special time in Sydney because the FMs had only been on the air a little while. And TUW had launched a new format in 1981, and we doubled our ratings in one survey, which was just unheard of. But then I came back to Canberra in May of 81, and I was music director when I was appointed, and a few months after that, the guy who was doing doing programming, Dave Gosper, who's still here in Canberra, he decided he didn't want to do it anymore, and the management said, "Well, do you want to be the program director?" And I think I was all of about 23 or something. So that was my first PD ship. And I stayed there for 7 years, and I helped get their supplementary FM licence, which was Kicks, which we now know and love as Mix 106.3. We got that up, and then I left a little while after and went to the ABC. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. Yeah.
And I suppose through all of that time you saw quite a few changes in the industry.
Yeah, but I must admit, not so much, let's say, in technology. I certainly saw a number of changes in formats and approaches to radio. But the technology that I started with was basically 2 turntables, 4 cart machines, 2 reel-to-reels. Now, by the time I'd left radio at the end of the 80s, the only thing that had come in that was significant was CD players. But we still had the turntables, we still had carts, and we still had reel-to-reels. I think that the next big leap in technology happened in the 90s, but by that time I'd left. Yeah. In fact, even when I was doing casual work on 2CA between 91 and 95, I was still using carts. Everything was on carts and CDs. Yeah. There was no digital storage systems. There were in other stations, but 2CA didn't have one at that time.
Right. It might be worthwhile explaining for some of the audience what a cart is.
Oh, sorry. A tape cartridge, which is a 1/4-inch tape, which is loaded onto like a plastic cassette, if you like. In fact, cartridges were originally called cassettes, audio cassettes, but I think they became known as cartridges to differentiate them between the domestic audio cassettes that we know and cartridges in broadcasting, which were a different kind of thing. And the tape sort of goes around in a clockwise motion. They have to be played in a special machine, and that's they were the things that had all the ads and all the jingles and the themes and all that stuff.
So a lot of work would have gone into the carts.
Well, there used to be a position in radio stations called a cart boy, or if it was a girl, a cart tart. And yeah, their job was to get the commercials that came in from the ad agencies on little 5-inch spools, and dub them from reel-to-reel, open reel-to-reel, onto the cartridges, and then they'd be put in the studio for the jocks to play through their shifts. And of course they were used heavily in news, which I talk about in the book. Yep. Where you get a situation with a voice report coming in from overseas, they're all put on carts. But of course carts died a bit of a death sometime in the 90s, and we don't hear much of them anymore.
Back pretty much when computers sort of took over that role.
Of course, yeah. And carts took over the role from material that used to be on discs, because when a lot of my mates started in radio in the 50s and 60s. They played commercials from discs, and that's why they needed to have panel operators, because there were just, so many things to do. But yeah, commercials, carts were really good for themes and commercials and things like that. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned news there for a moment, and of course now we just sort of take news as sort of de facto on radio. It's just there.
Yeah.
And I mean, it wasn't always the case, and it sort of developed over the years, I guess, to some extent. I mean, now we've got stations that just broadcast news all day. We've got others that just talk about the news all day, and then there are others that do news at the top of some hours, and others that just couldn't be bothered.
Triple M whenever we want it. You know?
And
well, I think that's an interesting thing that's taken up in chapter 9 of the book, is how news has fitted into the overall broadcasting sort of formatic mosaic, if you like. When 2UE started doing news on the hour in the 50s, it was like, oh wow, this is pretty interesting.
Will this survive?
Well, it was another way. In particular, stations like 2UE. 2GB was also active in the news on the hour scene, but 2UE were the first to do it, and they were the first to do it in small capsules of, say, 5 minutes, because in days before that, in the 40s and 50s, it was more traditional to have news broadcasts maybe 3 or 4 times a day. So there would be a main bulletin which would go for maybe 15 minutes, and it was very long and read very slow and turgid. And so the idea of the 5-minute news on the hour became a very convenient vehicle within top 40 formatting, because you knew, you get the music around the hour, and then bang, on the hour you get the news on the hour. And of course stations played with all that. We were just having a bit of a joke about news when you want it. I remember 2SM went through a stage of having news as it happens, which didn't last very long, and 2UE, again, being sort of cutting edge radio, a cutting edge radio station, as they have been for many, many years, they had a thing called news first fast 5 minutes sooner, which just meant that they positioned their news at 55 and 25 rather than on the hour and the half hour.
A bit like Channel 10 did with their TV news first at 5.
Exactly.
Which is now sort of been trumped by the others first at 4:30.
That's right. And look, every time, and there's a guy called John Williams who's a news editor from Adelaide. He talks about that this whole idea of moving news off the hour is something that the Americans are in love with, but it just doesn't seem to work in Australia. Stations have tried it. When I was at 2UW, we used to have news, I think, at 3 minutes to the hour, and 5KA in the 70s in Adelaide, they had news at 15 and 45. 3KZ at one stage had news at 20 and 50, and it's just, look, the argument behind it, the first fast 5 minutes sooner thing, was that 2UE could be out of news on the hour and back into music while everyone else was going to news. That was the thinking behind it. But of course, okay, if you've got news on the hour and everyone else has got news on the hour, then there is no music. So I think it was dreamed up as a point of difference, which is a good reason, of course. I think radio stations always need to have points of difference, but I think news on the hour is just something it's almost as Australian as Vegemite, Yeah, people expect it.
And I suppose that brought in the whole concept of having to time out for the news. You had to be there right on the hour.
Gee, I can tell you some stories about timeouts. Timing out for my generation of jocks was just what you did. Whenever you went into the studio, you knew you had your log, your commercial log, which was all paper, just in a folder. You had your little pile of 45s, or you'd have them in a box in a studio. You have a pack of carts and maybe a reel-to-reel tape to do your work on, to take calls and things. And when you sat there each hour and you worked through the hour, I don't know about other jocks, but I always started timing out about 20 to the hour. And you'd see jocks madly doing their sums on scraps of paper. And that's just what you did. You'd have to back time from the top of the hour from the pips. You have to sort of get back and think, okay, I've got a 3-minute record, then a 4-minute record, I've got a commercial break, I've got this, I've got that. Yeah, and you'd have to do it. So it was a bit of a skill, and it was always really, I suppose, rewarding when you played a record with a very strong cold end, a very sudden end. And if you got that on the 6th pip, wacko.
I suppose to the same extent there would have been a few people who missed the timeout.
Who wouldn't have heard it, or
no, who would have just sort of accidentally kept going through it?
Well, yeah. I think timing out became very essential when Top 40 radio moved to the, I suppose, its second big format, which was more music radio, and stations like 2SM, who were at the forefront of more music radio, they took a conscious decision that no longer will we just use little instrumental pieces of music to time out, because traditionally that's what Top 40 radio did. It would just pick little bits of instrumentals and time up to the hour. So sometimes you'd hear the jock back announcing a record, and then they go into, say, 30 seconds of inconsequential dirge, and then the news would start, because that was all to do with this news on the hour thing. But the format rule at 2SM was that your last record had to time out to the hour. Yeah.
So yeah, quite a skill there.
Oh, it was just one of the skills that jocks of that era had. And I guess, look, it still comes in, but you have situations now, and I've never worked in the digital environment, but I understand that it does catch-ups and things. Your whole hour can either slow down or speed up. Is that right?
Yeah, I believe it can.
Yeah.
I mean, I think personally I've spotted it a couple times on a couple stations where it's sort of a little bit noticeable that the digital audio is sounding a little bit off.
Yeah, I think that's how it works. It's just the way it's got to work, really, because particularly if you're automating, you've got no one in the building at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you have to have your next hour of music starting on the hour so that the automation can cope with everything, then that's the way it has to be. But, that's technology.
Yeah.
Yeah. So radio stations still have to time out. In fact, I was up on the Gold Coast a couple of weeks ago visiting my daughter, and I'm always very impressed to hear my friends Mr. Torv and Co. on the Hot Tomato station up there doing timing out and having the pips on, and that's a very unusual thing to hear on a contemporary music station in this day and age.
Yeah.
Whereas contemporary music station when I was a teenager, they all had pips, they all had news on the hour.
Well, I suppose one example of that could be some of the FM stations here in Canberra. I've sort of noticed that they seem to run an ad break around about the top of the hour and then run the news. So,
once again, that's a formatic principle, I guess, that's been around for a number of years. It used to be in the 70s that you'd play music into your news theme and go in that way, but I'm pretty sure that in 1970, got to think about it, I think it was about 76 when 2SM changed their approach to news, and by that I meant change the way they delivered the news, instead of it being a very strict 3 minutes and very 4 pars per story and all that sort of stuff. They got more conversational, and they started positioning their last ad break in the hour up to the news.
Right.
But no commercials in the news itself, so that they could get back to music. Yeah. And of course, talk stations or stations that were more talk-based rather than music-based, they always did things like they'd play ads up to the news because they really didn't have a format. They just did whatever felt good at the time.
Yeah, well, that's still fairly noticeable on a number of stations. They just sort of have a bit of conversation. And I mean, if you were listening, you wouldn't know that the ads are sort of semi-scheduled. I mean,
that's right.
You might have ads scheduled saying, well, we will do this at 20 past, but, it ends up at 25 past, and it goes for 2 minutes longer than they had planned, then they cut it off the next one.
Yeah.
Just happens. So, country radio would have sounded different, of course, to metro radio, which is what we've been talking about mostly so far. So,
you mean country radio in the old days, like 30 or 40 years ago? Yeah. Oh, my word, it did.
Yeah, so what sort of differences were there then?
That's a bit like a how long's a piece of string question.
Okay.
Only that, if you listen to a country station, say in northern Queensland in 1963, and then listen to, say, a country station in southern Victoria 5 years later, it's just poles apart.
Mm.
Country stations, the sound of country stations, or the content of what they were doing, was very much in the hands of what was happening within their community, what type of community they were, whether they were, in the wheat belt, or whether they were in cattle, or whether they were in say, a larger regional centre like Wollongong, where they had the steel industry.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's very hard to nail and say, look, this is the format that they followed, because they all did their own thing. And as I said at the opening of the interview, that most of the country stations, up until the last, say, 10 or 15 years, were independently owned rather than being owned by conglomerates like Macquarie.
Mm.
There were a few networks and groupings, but they weren't on the large scale that we have now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
With the networking now, you can have, say, John Laws in Sydney broadcasting to however many stations it is.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, there was networking in the old days. There was networking in the 40s when Jack Davey was on doing Sunday night sort of, the main broadcast of the week would go out from Sydney, and it'd go out to 80 stations around Australia or something like that. But that was a different kind of networking to what we know now. Usually when we say networking now, we tend to think of, say, the 2SM, I can't bring myself to say it, but super network. That sort of thing, where you've got their guys going out around country areas. That's networking as we know it now.
Yeah. Well, what we might do, we might take a quick break.
Yeah.